Yeah,
You just flip
I'll
the
use
switch,
one
yeah.
and then they can pass it around.
I was told there's no need for mics because they're recording them, but I don't understand that. So I'm just going to put this here for now.
The audience can do it. And
If you went around earlier, you don't think there will be questions? But,
Okay, if you want to take your seats, we'll get started in a couple of minutes. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out at 10 in the morning, talk about politics. I'm Steve Coll. I'm the dean here, and really great to see so many back this weekend. I'll introduce our panel and get started. Immediately to my left is Elisabeth Bumiller, class of 1979, and she's the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times. She's one of our award winners, alumni award winners, who we'll celebrate at lunch today. So it's very kind of her in the midst of what is always a busy season of news to come and do this with us on a Saturday. Elisabeth runs the DC bureau, which is huge and a big part of what the Times coverage is about these days. She's not actually responsible for political coverage, and wasn't in 2016, but she's part of the senior team that thinks about these things, so she's gamely been willing to speak collectively for the Times about this. Then to her left is Tom Namako, class of '05. Tom is now the head of breaking news at Buzzfeed, and he's also part of the editorial team that together plans and thinks about how to direct campaign coverage this year, as the cycle's already begun, obviously. And then to my far left is Morgan Radford, class of 2012, and she's a correspondent for NBC News based here in New York City. And she covered the 2016 campaign on the front lines and the midterms, and now is being hurled into our perpetual campaign cycle. Midterms just ended, didn't they? The title of the panel is Election Coverage 2020, How to Avoid a Repeat of 2016, but the question kind of begs some consensus or some outline of what it is we think failed in 2016. And I guess I want to ask the question as a journalism question, because there's a lot of failure in our culture and in our newsrooms about prediction or being out of touch with the issues that mattered or the sense of the electorate. Not all of that is reachable through journalism, maybe, but in terms of journalism practice, what do you think didn't go well in 2016 that animates your thinking about this cycle?
Well, I think can you hear me okay? I think overall what we failed to realize and understand was the depth of the animosity towards Hillary Clinton. And what we saw at the rallies, and you can talk about this, was this enormous outpouring of women who were very excited about her candidacy. What we didn't see were a lot of the suburban women, a lot of young people who were either, antagonistic towards her or just not excited about her candidacy and stayed home, as did a lot of African American voters. The Obama coalition did not turn out for Hillary. I think that, I will say this, I always say this, the national polls and our projections were right. She did win the national vote by 2% and 3 million votes. So those polls were exactly right on. And we were reacting to those polls. I also think that, I say this all the time, but for 80,000 votes in 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But we do have a system, but that we believe in we follow the Electoral College. So I think, but that was the main mistake. I think, I don't want to call it a failure of imagination, but I do think that there was also a reaction in the newsroom to Donald Trump. The Access Hollywood tape so close to the actual election, we just assumed that women would be as appalled as many of us were, and maybe women were, but they voted for him anyway. And so that was something we didn't account for. And I think we did have people out in the country. We did have Trip Gabriel living in Iowa for most of that year, but I think we did not tap into enough of that suburban sentiment. We did interview plenty of Trump supporters in diners, blue collar workers who loved Trump. There was plenty of that coverage, but I think we missed that sort of quieter suburban vote that didn't come out.
Interesting. So Tom, you're now running breaking news, and I don't know, were you doing that in 2016?
I was, yes.
Yeah. So it obviously complements the kinds of issues that Elisabeth was talking about, but breaking news is its own thing. You have to decide what's worth your attention in the moment. And so what are your reflections on the kinds of things you covered in 2016 that maybe in hindsight were either under or overemphasized?
There were two things that I would definitely do differently, and I have the great benefit here of being the person who actually made these decisions, so it's not on our political staff, which is good. A is that we covered, at the very beginning, we tried to act too much like the referee, as Trump was saying things that, were not said in the political sphere before. I think we, and to some degree other outlets, tried to act too much like the referee, saying that's out of bounds, or that's a penalty, oh, you can't do that, you can't say that, and instead he just kind of marched right by us. And dedicating too much time to the outrageous things he would say, the tweets, the kind of Trump said construction that was supposed to elicit from readers some kind of horror or some kind of reflection on what he's saying, just really didn't ultimately have the impact or the impact that we thought it would have. That was A. B, we did, like everyone else, we got out and we interviewed the Trump voters in the diners, and we went to, I think, every single rally. And the questions and the angles, I would definitely reconsider. A lot of them were just kind of asking people like, do you really agree with that? What he just said, do you? Yes? And everyone's like, yes, I do. And I agree with it. Or like, it doesn't bother me, And we probably could have used to refocus those questions in a much more significant way and use that reporting differently, for sure. The way we hope to change it this upcoming campaign is that, the general guidance, at least the way we're thinking of it, is that, this is not a game, and that the stakes are very, very real, and we have to deliver that message in a very kind of contemporary and very, very clear way for our readers.
Morgan, you were, so I was going to ask the question of what you're going to do differently, but maybe we can include it in the question about what went wrong from your perspective. You were a field correspondent. I don't know the fullness of your experience, like how many hostile rallies you've covered or how you've dealt with, So what was your experience of 2016, and how does it influence your contributions to deciding what stories to cover and how to cover them this time around?
I was in more. Can you hear me okay?
Is it flipped on?
That's not. 1, 2, 3. Oh, great. I was in more rallies and diners than I could count on election night in 2016, and then of course through the midterms. But I think what we failed to realize was what people wanted. We just didn't understand that this was a referendum on culture. And whether I was talking to an ultra-conservative, avowed white supremacist, or I was talking to a black hip-hop radio DJ, every single person across the spectrum said, we just want something new. We want to break from the traditional political paradigm. They were rejecting the traditional establishment politics that have created the very system as we now experience it. And I think we failed to realize that. And I think we certainly failed to get ahead of it. So for example, as Tom was mentioning, it was the angles in the question. We were so concerned with asking you who you were voting for, we weren't really asking why. And when we were asking why, we weren't asking you why in the right way. So the question isn't, hey, yo, Bob, are you a racist? The question is, hey, yo, Bob, do you value your small business tax cuts more than you value keeping Muslims in your country, right? That's a very different question. And so when we would get on the ground at these rallies, you would hear these seemingly contradictory views, right? I'd talk to a Trump supporter, I think I was in like Wisconsin, and they were like, look, I like Trump because he's for the little guy. And I'm like, bruh, he's a billionaire, right? And they're like, yeah, but he's for the little guy. And if you're really listening, it sounds illogical, but it's not. It makes perfect emotional sense. And so what we learned was that voting isn't one of these rational calculations where we're weighing all the pros and cons as a consumer choice. Instead, it's how people make you feel, right? It's like choosing a friend. It's like choosing a boyfriend. It's choosing a partner. It's you see something in someone else that you like, that reflects something you hope to see in yourself, even if you can't really name it. And so I think where the pundits really got it wrong was they did everything short of calling Trump voters stupid. That was wrong. It was rude. And it was inaccurate. But what they were saying, for example, is like, oh man, these Trump voters are going to be really disappointed when they realize that Mexico ain't paying for that wall. They knew Mexico wasn't going to pay for that wall. They were at every single rally chanting that, we want the wall. That was the most consistent chant I heard at these rallies. And they knew Mexico wasn't going to pay for the wall. But guess what? Trump made them feel like he cared about immigration as much as they did. And that feeling created real policy. So they didn't get Mexico to pay for that wall, but guess what? They had families separated on the border, and they had children in cages. So we saw actual policies that happened from that feeling. And so we have to figure out going forward how to ask the right questions to understand what people want in a way that will not make them shy to really admit what they're going to do in the ballot box.
So that's great. And so when we were talking before we came together today, you were describing a kind of story that you try to do now that's more, I wasn't quite sure, it made sense as you were describing it, but I'm not
Steve
sure I
Coll,
can
you're gonna catch me off
recapitulate
guard.
it.
You're gonna get me in trouble. Are you
Well,
gonna make me tell my sources and my scoops? Man, what's
No.
going on?
It was a kind of a genre of trying to report on the culture in which voters decide, and that you came out of 16 thinking that there were certain kinds of stories that other journalists weren't doing that you could do. So describe what that kind of story is.
So my probably favorite and most interesting story I did last year was on the midterm elections. And we called the Southern Poverty Law Center, found out there was an unprecedented number of self-avowed, publicly proclaimed white nationalists running for public office. So of course we know that people who are racist have run for office for years. But this was different. They were saying they had these racist policies and they felt comfortable doing it, but the question was, why do you feel comfortable doing it now? And so I sit across from this guy and, I'm a black person, mixed race, don't really know what he thought. He finds out in this moment in real time that oh, she a black girl, right, sitting across from me, right? And he says that my intelligence came from my white side, but he wants to make sure that dumb black people are basically, kept at less than 10% in any of his neighborhoods. And so we were talking, this was one of these rare moments we were hearing this connection between feeling and policy. But then I read a different report that was talking about the number of college-educated white men who were voting for Trump and who had planned to vote for him again and for his surrogates in the midterms. And I have covered many stories. It took me 3 months to get this white supremacist to talk to me, but the only story to date I have not been able to book in the history of my career was finding one of these college-educated white Trump supporters to come and speak with me on a panel about why they were voting for his surrogates in the midterms. And I think that said something so profound about the not only their feelings and their comfort coming forward, but the divisiveness in this country. One of them said to me on the phone plainly, he's like, I'm not doing this publicly because I travel a lot for work and the country has become so divisive that I'm afraid for my family if I leave, or that my business, people aren't going to come to my business if I say that I voted for Trump. So I think that kind of goes to a different piece about the power of language. I mean, the real battlefield in this past election, and what I think we're also seeing going forward if we're looking at candidates like Elizabeth Warren, that battlefield is rhetoric. That battlefield is language. And I think we have a very serious challenge as journalists as to how we respond to those firing shots.
So, Tom, you said that your team has decided that in thinking about this cycle, your guiding principle is it's not a game, there's a lot at stake. How does that translate into editorial decisions or news decisions, or the headlines you write or the choices you make?
The headlines are good. The headlines are exclusively quizzes only and lists, and that's it. This time around, instead of covering the Pete Buttigieg, is he going to run? Is he not going to run? What is going to happen? Build up to his exploratory committee, I think, than his actual announcement. What we did was we assigned 2 reporters to cover 2 what we thought were important angles to whatever his candidacy might be. One was to look at his program of bulldozing houses in South Bend. I think he wanted to bulldoze 1,000 houses in a very, very short period of time. And what the actual impact of that was to him, it was a very data-driven decision. It was part of a revitalization effort for the area. And what we found was that in his sense of good. I'm doing this, it's numbers based, it has to be good. A lot of people who were minorities obviously were obviously very, very impacted by that. There was an amazing example of a woman who had purchased a house and was like working on like the siding or something, and a city official drove up and was like, "What are you doing?" And she was like, "I'm working on my house." He was like, "That's going to be bulldozed tomorrow. What are you talking about?" And suddenly this person was like entered into the city bureaucracy and had to like save this piece of property that she had bought not long ago. And then also for Mayor Pete, we looked at his support in the LGBT community and what the resonance there is with the kind of hope that Obama had for people, and how that resonates for LGBT people, and what kind of financial support he was getting, especially in Iowa. He is a candidate who kind of doesn't run on that, similar to the way that Obama didn't really, I feel like, run on race necessarily. And we kind of looked at that, and I was very happy, I was very proud of those two stories that we did, that, we focused our efforts there instead of focusing on the ramp up to announcements, the staffing up, and those things.
Right, so those examples are responsive, I think, to the sort of standard and maybe a little bit too easy critique of political journalism, which is that it falls for the horse race and it doesn't cover the candidates' biographies or voters and their interests or the issues. That's a continuous refrain in media criticism. But Elisabeth, I guess when you think about changes in political journalism over the last 8-10 years, the speed of the news cycle is obviously one of them, but prediction and polling is another. There was a great emphasis on prediction. There still is at 538, and I need not remind you of that predictor on the top of your app on election night 2016. But you mentioned that the polls were accurate overall, but what do you think the function of covering polls and working on the kind of horse race stuff is? I mean, what do you think about that is legitimate about that coverage, and what do you think can be overdone?
I think the big problem, as I said, is we didn't understand. The state polls were so off in 2016, and we were relying on them and factoring them in. I think you still need to, people look at polls. We are going to be using polls once again, but we're doing it differently. I don't oversee the polling, but you saw the live polling we did in some of the House races in 2018, just to show people, it was fascinating to show people how hard it is to get to an actual number and how many calls you have to make. It was polling in real time. It was a real breakthrough. So I think we'll be doing more of that, just to show people that polls are not definitive. And by the way, my son, who's working on a PhD in math, will always say that, when we said that Hillary Clinton had an 85% chance of winning, he said, that isn't all that great. And we just didn't explain that to people, that did not mean she had 85% of the vote,
Yeah, that was the defense that statisticians gave. It's sort of like, if you wake up in the morning and you see that there's an 85% chance of rain, and you take your umbrella and you walk around and it doesn't rain, you don't come home and slam your umbrella in the closet and say, I thought it was supposed to rain. No, you realize sometimes it's the 15% happens.
Right.
So yeah.
So anyway, I think there'll be more explaining this time. But just to talk to you about every cycle. I've been through so many cycles now, either as a candidate reporter or as an editor. Every cycle at the New York Times and all other media organizations, we say we are going to cover the issues, and then we don't do a fantastic job of it. I think this time, what is different this time, I just want to say, is we do not trust our own predictions and instincts. We were so blown away last time. And right now, the Washington Bureau, there's people saying, he's going to win, he's going to win. He's got 37% support right now. But people are just assuming, do not take anything for granted right now.
Yeah, my facetious assumption is that, because from my experience at the Post newsroom, is that given what happened in 2016, we're going to so overcorrect. There's going to be so many reporters out in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania just saturating the places. and then the election's going to be decided in California somehow.
Right. Well, that's right.
We're going to
Right.
miss it.
You always fight the last war. So as you predicted it, we have lots of reporters now out in the States. We're going to change all that. There's 16 political reporters right now. That does not include the Washington reporters who are covering Trump as a candidate. So we are, flooding the zone. And but again, I think the main thing is just not to trust our own assumptions and to try and keep away from the coasts.
So let's talk about the where the election will eventually be decided, no doubt. But let's talk about the Democratic primary, because that's also unusual. I mean, this is the largest field, certainly in my living memory, and what should journalists do to hold the process accountable for those readers who are interested in the Democratic primary and an outcome? I think one of the critiques of 2016 was that, you know, the kind of Bernie complaints about the fix being in really didn't get the journalistic attention or the transparency or the investigative reporting that perhaps they deserved. Here you have a very awkward situation where the DNC has rewritten the rules. You've got all these bizarre debate rules unfolding. And you also have this massive field in which everybody's kind of an underdog except for one or two people. So how do you cover that, do you think? What are your instincts about it?
Well, how do we cover that? Well, we're starting with, I think we're being pretty tough on every candidate who comes out. You saw the stories about, it was in the paper this morning. Yeah, I was reading it last night. The Beto story this morning was very tough on him. He was the darling, he's so last month, right? Now it's been, our stories of Buttigieg have been tough, and we've had a lot of tough coverage of Biden. He had a rough start 2 days ago. We had the interview with Anita Hill. That took us a little while
Was
to
it
get
your
that.
story about Amy Klobuchar?
Clean
the fork.
Yeah, that was our story
was
about Amy
also a rough
Klobuchar.
launch,
So
yeah.
everybody's getting kind of, we hope, the same aggressive treatment. Bernie needs, we haven't done too much on Bernie yet. There's stories in the pipeline. So that's the beginning. I mean, I never seen, in 2016, we abandoned the long run series, which is these endless long stories about the candidates. We brought those back. I think they're just, again, I can't take credit for them, although Peter Baker's doing one really good one. But I think those are great, and I think they're good to get out early to give people a sense of the background of a candidate, how he was shaped and formed. I learned a huge amount about Beto just reading that story this morning.
Yeah, it was a very good story. So, Tom, we can all righteously say we should cover the issues and the voters and the deep biographies of the candidates, but you also are sitting there watching the metrics. What do people read? What do they want to read about during a campaign?
Oh boy. What people want to read is often not what the issues are. Although I think in the past couple of months I've been definitely surprised. The two Buttigieg stories that I had mentioned did actually quite well, surprisingly well. So I do think that not to sound like completely over optimistic here, but I do think that we see that people are actually reading about issues. I also think that in terms of what people read, there is a responsibility on the side of what we would call curation. We have a curation team. It's explicitly, and I'm sure everyone has some form of this, but it's the team specifically that puts out our journalism on platforms, right? And I think that is something that newsrooms have to think more deeply about. Continuing to promote, let's say, Elizabeth Warren's plan for college loans. Instead of re-promoting that by just kind of slamming the share button on Saturday morning and letting the headline go back out that everyone has seen already, what we try to do, and what might be a good idea for the industry at large, is to try to repackage these stories in the most engaging way possible. When you publish something, it's great, get the headline out there and let it fly. We've experimented a lot with threads, geared at different times toward different audiences. Instagram stories does very well, and that's something that we've been trying to corner. A lot of our readership comes from, believe it or not, our Instagram stories. Not a lot of our readership, but it is a very powerful tool for us. And just thinking about how we can re-promote stories that actually hit on the issues is something that we need to think about a little more.
Tom, speaking of Instagram, Buzzfeed has a really strong record of doing reporting about propaganda and manipulation online and bot factories and the rest. And now, as a breaking news editor, you're in an environment where we know there's going to be more Russian active measures, plus lots of other kinds of manipulation campaigns. How does that affect what you? How do you ramp up your ability to not be faked in a breaking news context where you've got a short time to make judgments?
The first thing, just an astonishing number. I think Poynter wrote about a study that was recently done, and it said that 15% of the journalists they surveyed in newsrooms across the country feel like they are well trained enough on disinformation, bots, fake news to actively and accurately report it. Only 15%. It takes an immense amount of training, judgment, and also the most important thing, just patience, which is the opposite of what social media is. Obviously, it is the most impatient infrastructure we've ever built. And just realizing that the first rule is that the 10-second blurry clip that has no context to it is usually never true. There was, in the midterms, there was that video of the person trying to vote for a Republican, and instead the lights came up for all the Democratic candidates, which someone tweeted out. It was a malfunction. It was in Ohio, I think. It was a malfunction. Someone tweeted it out. Suddenly it was on 4chan, then God help us 8chan, and then it just like exploded into the very, very far right conservative stratosphere, and was pretty much unstoppable. And we had to. Sorry, I'm just kind of bouncing around here. I think one of the lessons is that in 2016, the way we would have covered that is we would have led with the information. No, this video of depicting this is fake. Instead, what we did, and what we're trying to do more, what we did more in the midterms, what we're doing more now coming into 2020, is holding either the networks as accountable as possible or the platforms as accountable as possible. So for that voting video, we asked Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and I think another platform about it. Is it still up? The original source is still up. What are you guys doing about it? Everyone took it down but Twitter. And Twitter said, we believe that there's enough positive information out there to counteract it, which is just so not true. That video is still flying around. That account that initially tweeted it out was active up until not long ago. Just this morning on my way up here, I just checked to the mentions of that account. There are people still mentioning the account. It was a QAnon account that initially tweeted it out. People are still mentioning that account in tweets, trying to get the account's attention about that specific video. So it only shows how things just never die, and how I think we have to transition from pointing to specific things and saying that thing is fake to holding more accountability for our platforms, for the networks that run them, and yeah.
So Morgan, just to go back to the Democratic primary, which is I think going to be the main story for the next 12 months as the president prepares for his re-election campaign. When former Vice President Biden announced he went right after Trump, and it generated some commentary that he was really one of the few Democrats to decide that was going to be his tactic, and that the rest of the field seemed influenced by the midterms and the Democrats who won in Trump districts by running on kitchen table issues and healthcare and the like. From your experience covering the midterms and all this time you've been spending with voters in the field, where are voters on someone who goes right after Trump, or what do they really want to hear about from a presidential candidate in your experience?
Trump is certainly something that always comes up, right? But I think one mistake that we made, even when we're talking to voters or about voters, is you often hear the networks, pundits, whoever gets on cable news, talk about telling voters what it is that they think, right? And you hear a lot of this prescriptive language, like, ooh, the Democrats can't go too far left or they won't get elected, or voters are tired of too much chaos in the White House. When you're actually there and talking to the voters, a lot of those voters are saying, I'm actually quite comfortable with the chaos. I like the chaos because the chaos shows me that things are working. The chaos shows me that we're angering the right type of people and we're shaking things up, right? So what you also, I think we have to be careful of is when we talk about this field of Democratic candidates, we cannot dismiss the candidates, right? Look at Mayor Pete. We also can't dismiss these ideas because what were once seemingly fringe ideas are now becoming mainstream. We're seeing things, resolutions, like that we just haven't even seen before. We're talking about things like a universal, basic income. Hello, Andrew Yang. We're talking about reparations. I heard Julian Castro talking about reparations. Elisabeth Warren talked. When was the last time we talked about reparations, right? We're talking about things that we just had never considered before. And I think that is one of the biggest things we have seen come out of the improbability of a Trump presidency, right? We learned that voters wanted to believe in a world where a reality TV star could become president or a waitress from the Bronx could become the most powerful member of Congress. They wanted to see this sort of populist pull. And so I think we can't dismiss the candidates who are coming in, the dark horses, and we can't dismiss the policies that they're coming in with, because I also actually don't think you can overcorrect for having too many reporters outside of the Beltway. And the reason I think that is because we're really not going to miss California. We're not going to miss New York because we're all in New York talking about it, right? But I think what we learned from talking to people on the ground and looking at these fringe ideas is that the political narrative today is now happening outside of Washington. What's happening in those kitchen tables discussions, that's driving what's happening in Washington. It's no longer reacting to what's happening in Washington. And that's something we learned, and voters made us listen.
Could I just say something?
Yeah, please.
I just think Biden obviously is playing to the Democratic base and say, his first message, as we saw, was, I'm the one who can beat Trump. I can take Trump on. And polls are showing over and over again, or Democrats are saying, we'll vote for anybody who can beat Trump. So I think that was his first big message out of the gate. Now, in the next weeks, he's going to have to come up with big policies on health care, on job creation, on training, all the things all those kitchen table issues you're talking about. And he hasn't yet, but I think that is the strategy he's using because he's playing to the big Democrats. Well, I have no idea, but so I'm just pointing that out.
I mean, of course, it's normal for the party of the incumbent president to lose seats in the House in the midterm, especially in their first term. But the Democrats did way overperform their potential, and the reason seems to have been turnout primarily, crazy high turnout among Democratic voters, and I don't know. So how does that translate into this election? So is that really just saying that you've got to fire up Democratic voters?
I think so. I mean, there was a poll out recently last week, I think, showing that for once, young people turned out in the midterms, and it was an extraordinary percentage. I don't remember the numbers, but it was in the Post, I believe. And then, and also African Americans turned out. So that gives Democrats a great deal of hope for 2020.
So Morgan, in your experience, what do young voters? What is firing them up? It can't be that they want to fix Obamacare, is it? I mean, what is it that they want?
Yeah, we looked at millennials. They have I think in this next election, they could be, if they turned out in number, the largest voting bloc in this country, which is huge. The issues have shifted. I mean, one of the things I hear most frequently is discussions around college debt. I mean, Elisabeth Warren was making waves with millennials. They wanted to hear, well, what's your plan for me, right? I mean, people who are graduating, wanting to know if there's a place for them. I do think, of course, healthcare is a big one. But again, I have to say, I think there's a big, big pull towards this cultural movement and rhetoric and feeling like they want to take their country back, because I think a lot of millennials are feeling like they don't recognize their country anymore. They're saying, how did we get to this place where we're hearing things about S-hole countries from the same electorate that elected Obama, 4 years earlier? So I think while we're hearing the nitty gritty when it comes to the policy issues around healthcare, when it comes to college tuition, I think there's still this larger question about who is going to represent me when it comes to those identity politics.
All right, well, that's great. Maybe we can start to invite people to line up and ask questions of their own. If you want, there's a microphone there. Let me just ask one more. I mean, Morgan, if you look at the millennial polling, obviously if only millennials voted, we would have a very different government and a very different country.
Outcome.
And yet they haven't generally voted in their numbers. As we were just saying, the midterms were the first time that they really overperformed in turnout. So I don't want to make it about particular candidates, but Bernie has this strange appeal. I guess the kind of cliche is that it's his authenticity. But what's your sense of what millennial voters are looking for in the characteristics of a candidate, the kind of way they speak, the way they relate to change in Washington, the way they talk to the country?
Number 1, 2, and 3 I always hear is authenticity. But I don't think, and this is just my personal hot take, don't quote me, don't attribute this to NBC, I don't think that for millennial candidates, Bernie stands up when you're coming against like a Mayor Pete or even a Kamala. I mean, I think they are connecting to young voters in different ways. Kamala's, doing a little ditty bop on Instagram with her hair pulled back. Beto's using, at the dentist's office on Snapchat. I mean, but what's interesting is don't get it twisted. We're not all, we're not enamored with the sparkle to the extent that a lot of my friends, I just turned 31, a lot of people who were, as we talked about, Elizabeth mentioning before, in love with Beto, have completely kind of gone sour on him. They're like, yeah, he's talking, I hear a lot of hope, but you didn't bring that hope heat like Obama did. You didn't have that kind of hope. You didn't have that change I was looking for, right? And they're not hearing a lot of policy. So, I think they're looking for people who are going to connect with them, but they do want substance and not just style. But the question I asked this millennial voter in South Carolina, she's from a Republican family, and she said for the first time she was voting Democrat. I said, all these polls show what we can do if we come out, but why should we believe you? Every year we talk about, ooh, there's gonna be this big millennial wave, and y'all never show up. Y'all are still sitting there watching Square Bod Sponge Pants, And she was like, she goes, no, I'm gonna come out now, and the reason I'm gonna come out now is I never in a million years would have thought that my rights as a woman would be threatened. And that's why I'm voting. Which was a kind of powerful statement. In the year of our Lord, 2018, at the time, she's feeling like her rights as a woman are being challenged. That was not something I expected to hear. And so if that is the type of thing people are reacting to, I think they will come out.
Okay, great. Please.
Good morning. My question is about what I perceive to be a bit of a disconnect between a lot of the work that is going on and has gone on for decades in political science and some of the reporting and the reaction we see to 2016. And so looking to 2020, it seems like we're responding to, what did we learn in 2016 when there's a bunch of stuff that we should have been learning from 2008 to 2016 to 2016 that would have explained a lot of what happened. And I specifically mean shifts that were happening in the Democratic Party, what we were learning about polarization and how people were feeling about specific issues that did not have a partisan tinge before, but started to because things were clarified in the minds of some people after the election of Barack Obama. And so my question to you is, and I work in a network newsroom, so I'm not calling any one or any entity out, but I do feel like we're still going forward without a strong underpinning of political science and data, and not just sort of the kind of polling that we're doing now, but real research about where people are, how people were being activated by what kind of language on both sides in 2016. And I worry that we're still bringing some of those false narratives forward in our reporting, and that we're not kind of where we need to be and really understanding deeply where people are and why they're voting the way they are. So what are your thoughts about those issues and how we're moving forward with research and data and sort of political science?
I mean, there is this, just to take one example, there is this, very well-established political science about the structure of polarization. You probably all read that book, The Big Sort. It's dated, but it's still very accurate. It's not just social media that polarizes us. We've all moved to live next to like-minded people. and so I don't know how you cover something like that or how it informs your coverage, but it's part of the reality of not just our politics, but also politics in Europe and other industrialized democracies where there's a realignment between kind of the countryside and urban elites and other kind of complicated shifts that are more seismic than kind of campaign competition.
Well, let me ask you a question. I don't know exactly how to answer how we address your concerns. What would you suggest that would happen? I'm just curious because, we wrote there was a fabulous piece just a couple of days ago about how Twitter is not the real world, which we all loved very much at the Times, because we're so. But what would you suggest we do?
Well, I think that I still hear people talking in newsrooms about the forgotten person and how people candidates aren't, or how they're going to reach out to the white working class, and I still think that, and I still hear people talking about economic anxiety when a lot of that at the time when those articles were being written, those things had been I don't want to say disproven, but we were sort of not looking deeply at, as I said, the political science research about how people had moved between 2008 and 2016, what people were leaving the Democratic Party and ready to be picked off by a nationalist campaign, by appeals to Islamophobia, by appeals to those sorts of things. So if we looked at that research, I'm thinking about like Michael Tesler and some of those, that kind of work, if we had more of an underpinning of that kind of data in our reporting, I don't think we would be making a lot of the same mistakes that we're making now.
I don't think people believe the premise. I think your point is well taken because the data was there, but they weren't looking at it. I actually wasn't very surprised. When I was in this hall at Columbia, I wrote my master's thesis on the invisibility of white poverty. And I looked at elite universities and how the most underrepresented group at the nation's most elite university were actually working class, white, and Christian men. In certain years, if you look at the data where they were looking at Columbia, Harvard, and you heard this I went to find them, asked them what they thought. It was a lot of this economic anxiety that you heard coming out of the rural South, people who are coming into spaces and finally talking about the fact that they felt like they were invisible. But I don't think a lot of people were hearing the data. I don't think they were looking at the data.
So, yeah, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Elisabeth. I work at CNN right now in the affiliate division, so I don't work on talk shows. I produce stories for local stations, and we focus on reporting on issues that have impact on people so that they download it. It applies to everyone, right? When I go out on breaking news stories and I try to find people to interview, Nat Pops, breaking news, what's your reaction? If I mention, hi, I'm Elisabeth with CNN, and it happens to be someone who does not like CNN because they feel that CNN is attacking the president unjustly, they go, CNN is fake news, I'm not going to talk to you. And that's fair. That's their right. I go on and I try to find someone else to talk to. But inevitably, the people who are willing to talk to me are more likely to be Democrats. And that's a problem because I want to tell the whole story. And then when I go out with a package that's mostly Democratic sounding, people come back and they go, you didn't talk to enough Republicans. Are you guys having conversations within your newsrooms, with yourself, about what we're going to do to regain credibility with people who think that we are unjustly attacking the president? And what are you guys doing about it so that this time around we're getting the whole conversation and not just the people who are readily like, yes, oh my God, I would love to talk to MSNBC or New York Times, like hashtag, not my president. What are we doing to fix that?
This is a question I get a lot. I'm, as a fellow enemy of the people,
I don't want to be the enemy,
I know, but we get it a lot, the failing New York Times and so forth. I used to say it doesn't mean anything. I now think it's very corrosive, and I think it's a problem. But I'm always asked, what can we do about it? And we don't really have an answer other than continuing our journalism. We're not going to go out, we're not sort of targeting Republican readers. But I don't think our reporters have quite the same trouble, maybe a little bit, about not talking to us. I think maybe it's different. We're not putting them on camera. But I remember it happening, actually. I used to cover George W. Bush and covering him in Texas and going to talk to somebody in Waco, and they would say, oh, you work for the New York Times, that's Pravda. I would get that, way back when. I don't know what to tell you other than there must be some Republicans out there. It's every single Republican you try. But there's moderate Republicans in this country. They're not all, watching Fox News.
Right. No, it's not every Republican that I
Yeah.
come across on. But I do hear continually from conservative friends who don't work in media that even when they read our headlines and they read our stories, they think that because the story is critical of the president, that we are inherently giving more airtime and more space and inches to democratic ideals. And when I look at who we're quoting in stories, sometimes I understand why they feel that way.
Well, Elisabeth, I mean, the New York Times is, very broadly based subscribers, but I would assume there's fewer Trump voters than non-Trump voters among your subscriber base.
It's proprietary, but yes, we have more Democratic readers than Republicans.
Yeah,
Yes.
and so does that ring in your ears as an editor from time to time?
Yeah. I don't know what the solution is. We are tough on everybody. We're tough on we're very tough on the Democrats. We had a contentious relationship with the Obama White House. You know this. This is how we always are. But it's Trump has been extremely successful in portraying us as biased, as fake news. There's no real solution as far as I can tell, except for continuing what we do. And we're not, seeking out Republican readers. We do in the opinion pages. We have conservative columnists. They're not, Bret Stephens, David Brooks. We don't have any real Trump supporters among our conservative columnists.
Kind of never Trump Republicans are the yeah.
Yeah.
But Morgan, when you covered, say, I don't know if you covered Trump rallies a few times, but I've talked to other television reporters who've done so, and they've said it's rough. You're in the pen, you get spit at, you get yelled at. Somebody comes by, flips you the bird, curses you out, and then the reporter will say, "Would you like to talk to CNN? Can we have your views?" And they say, "Sure." They turn around and talk. Do you find that some of the people who are hostile are nonetheless ready to go on air and share their views?
Absolutely. I think most importantly, they want to feel heard. I remember, it's funny, I was at one of these Trump rallies, and one of the most common phrases you'll hear is they'll start their question or response with, "Well, no offense, but," and then we know y'all are the fake news, but, and then they'll start, their whole thing. And I don't know what came over me. One day I had just had enough. I was sitting out in front of Trump Tower, and this lady came out and she started, "Well, we know y'all are fake news, but," and I said, "Ma'am," and this is all in the air. I was like, "Ma'am, I just have to pause you for a minute. I live out of my suitcase 5 days a week. I sit in my apartment maybe sometimes 2 days a month, and I do this because this is very real for me and none of this is fake. Do you really think that I would do this because I wanted to lie to you? Why would I ask you this question if I already knew the answer?" And she just stopped and thought about it for a minute, and she was like, "Well, okay, not you, but the rest of them." All right, Jan, well, the rest of us, and it just, it's tough, but they really do just want to be heard. And remember, I even have a problem sometimes with the way we talk about it, right? The Trump voter as this othering thing. There are Trump voters in my family, right? There are Trump voters who are my next door neighbors. There are, this is, if they are, we can't otherize people who vote and think differently than us. That is part of the problem. And so I think they do just want to be heard, just like we want to be heard. Everyone wants to be heard. And I think you do see them become, a little bit more defenseless, but those pins are rough. There's a lot of spit and a lot of birds being flipped.
Well, by the way, there's a mixed bag. I mean, the White House reporters. First of all, it's very threatening sometimes in those rallies. It's gotten scary. I mean, as you know, the network correspondents often have security guards now. But Mark Landler, one of our White House correspondents, tells a funny story about how he was at a rally and there was all these menacing people screaming at the reporters, and then CNN sucks, New York Times, all that stuff. And then he said the guy came up to me and said, "Don't believe that. We're just playing along. Don't listen to us. It's part of the show."
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Elizabeth. Yeah, I mean, it's, street reporting is always, the rate of refusal in street reporting has always been striking, long before Trump. And people are confused about journalism and media. The Columbia Journalism Review just did some kind of shocking, it was a big special issue, it's worth taking a look at it, called How They See Us or something like this, essentially about how journalism is viewed these days. They did a survey, and a shocking number of respondents said that sources pay journalists to write stories about them. So anyway, there's a lot of confusion about what it is we do for a living. Sir.
Hi. You didn't mention at all so far two issues: foreign policy, China, trade, North Korea, NATO, the collapse of the European Union, Venezuela, Cuba, Mexico, and go. And the aftermath of the Mueller report, the investigation, impeachment. Are the issue going to have any impact at all on the presidential election?
The Mueller report?
Both,
Yes, and all the
policy-
foreign policy.
Mueller
yes.
report and foreign policy.
We have found that nobody out on the campaign trail is asking about the Mueller report or the Russia investigation. It has had, Trump's approval rating went down a bit right after it came out, a couple points, but no one is asking about it. We have reporters out this weekend, but some of our congressional reporters are out around the country to do a story on that, and we expect that no one is going to. That's just the fact. It had a huge impact in Washington, obviously. It's had a big impact on the intelligence agencies, on the FBI, on Congress, but no one is asking. What we are seeing, as I'm sure you're seeing as well, is a very slow, gradual movement towards impeachment. In the beginning, Nancy Pelosi has held her Democratic caucus firm, but you're seeing now that there's a small group that is saying we need to move towards impeachment. But we can have a whole long conversation about the pros and cons as the Democrats see it of that.
So, Tom and Morgan, on the foreign policy question, it's a good one. We didn't talk about it earlier. Those of us who are part of the establishment find it kind of shocking how many departures this administration has made, denigrating European allies, threatening to quit NATO. We could go down a long list. There really are departures, radical departures in some cases. They don't seem to resonate so much in campaign politics. Joe Biden said at the Munich Security Conference, "We'll be back," meaning we will restore America's previous system of alliances and assumptions. But I don't hear other Democratic candidates talking about the restoration of the sort of Washington consensus or anything like that, because they know voters aren't there. That's not what voters are interested in. Is that a fair reading of what's going on, do you think?
I agree with what Elisabeth said in terms of on the campaign trail. We don't hear people really, yelling about the Mueller report for sure. And usually the stories, the kind of like foreign-oriented stories that are really read for us is whenever we publish something on Trump Tower Moscow, which is always, that gets a lot. I think in terms of foreign policy, I think the thing that is most resonant, at least for our readers, who are mostly in that millennial age range, is immigration-based and our relationship with Mexico and Central America. And we had a reporter who traveled with the caravan that I think it began in El Salvador or Guatemala, I'm not sure, and went through Mexico, and that he took it along with everybody, and that really, really did resonate. That was something that really hit home, and I do think that I have not heard too much about that on the campaign yet, on the campaign trail with a lot of Democrats, besides the kind of this is bad. I haven't heard any prescriptive solutions necessarily yet, and I think that is going to be possibly the largest arena to dive into, at least for us, in terms of foreign policy.
Morgan, President Obama was more popular in Germany than he was in the United States. He was worldwide the most popular American president since Kennedy, and probably more popular than Kennedy, even at Kennedy's peak. And it was a kind of soft power that the United States had. His credibility in the world, caused people to compromise on things they might not otherwise agree with as policy. Now you have almost a reversal of that position, where our president is highly unpopular around the world and seen as frightening in many parts of it, including in countries that we've traditionally been allied with. Does anyone have a sense of that on the campaign trail, that this has been a big reversal in America's place in the world? Do they care? What do you hear?
I'd have to say I second mostly what Tom said. When I'm in the field, that is just not what people care about, and it's not what they're talking about. I can't even remember which Russian bombshell it was, but one of these dropped, and Today Show sent me to Wisconsin, like that night. So I show up in Wisconsin the next day, and I'm like, what do you think about what just happened? Like, you just were a flipped county, and you voted for Trump in this last cycle. What do you think now? I mean, are you still loyal to Trump? And they were like, what? Where? Who? Like, it just was not. And then I honestly, that was my assignment. That was the assignment I was tasked in. I got to get paid. I got to do my job. But at some point, I stopped and I called back and I said, guys, I'm so sorry, but this just isn't the story. And I can't, with a good conscience, sit here and keep pushing this question because they don't care. So I think that's part of how we see the networks here in New York driving the coverage about what's happening on the ground. And we have to, and luckily I do have responsive bosses who trust their reporters and say, okay, well, we'll switch the story. If you tell me what the story is, Morgan, right? But they're not really caring. I think what Tom was saying about we do hear a lot more when it's coming to like Dreamers and a lot of what's happening in Mexico. Partly, of course, that's geographic proximity, but also has to do with a lot of us have families who are immigrants. I mean, a lot of us have families who are going through those things. So I think you do find people who are more interested in those policy things when they are personally affected by it. But generally speaking, when that personal connection is absent, especially among millennials, it's just not something that I think the candidates are even talking about because they know it's not something that polls particularly well.
Great, thank you.
Hi, my name's Dennis. I worked on the House Foreign Affairs Committee for 13 years. So I have two questions for you about Congress in this election. The first is, obviously the House is broken. When I worked there on the committee, Hyde, Lantos, they worked together. China, Putin's bad, 9/11. Now it's total dysfunction. You've got Steve King and his racist remarks and the Tea Party, and you've got the Justice Democrats, and let's impeach the effer. And so my question, and then my last boss was Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, who just threw up her hands. I mean, she was a refugee. She has elder people in Miami, so she supported Obamacare or opposed revision. And the leadership just said, you're not going to get anything, so she left town. And then she left her Cuban coffee maker for Donna Shalala, her Democratic successor, and got that. So my question, the House is broken. How do you fix it? The second's on impeachment. As I said, I worked for Hyde, but after he was Foreign Affairs. But they never had the numbers to get a conviction in the Senate. It seems the same now. Maybe you'd get Lisa Murkowski or Romney. But the question is, do you see this becoming part of the political season, impeachment, given that the votes aren't there in the Senate?
I do. Well, the first question, how do you fix the House? I can't answer that question. All right. Secondly, yeah, I do see it becoming an issue. I think Beto said yesterday he would be for impeachment. So you're beginning to see the candidates one by one jump on. And obviously...
Does Nancy Pelosi have to agree, or is...
No, well, yes. I think what they're going to do, I mean, right now, we have debates about this all the time in the office. Obviously, they're not going to get a conviction in the Senate. But so the big debate is, Nancy Pelosi said that Trump had engaged in highly unethical and unscrupulous behavior. Those, as you know, are perfect grounds for impeachment. They are, but the Democrats seem to be, once again, fighting the last war and figuring that just the way it damaged Bill Clinton, this would damage the Democrats' chances in 2020, and there'll be a backlash and Trump will win. So what they're doing is saying, as you can see, we're going to investigate, we're going to hold hearings. The Attorney General is appearing next week for hearings. They've called Mueller, they're trying to call the former White House counsel, Don McGahn. These hearings will drag on for a long time. They will investigate, and what she's saying now is, let's move down the road and see where we are in impeachment. They will investigate, they will hold hearings, and by the summer of 2020, with a few months to go before the election and no sign of no way to anyone will convict in the Senate, that the goal is to damage Donald Trump over the next year or so. And I do not unless something surprising happens, if Don McGahn testifies, and we've talked about what happens. You know, the Bumiller report is full of, as you know, shocking revelations. But people haven't read it. It's 448 pages. So what happens if on it's live television and you see the White House counsel talk about this in very blunt, raw terms? Will that change any kind of opinion in the country? I don't know. But I think what the Democratic goal right now is just to damage Trump ahead of 2020.
When you mentioned it, I mean, I assume Nancy Pelosi has in mind what happened in the late 90s. We were all covering it, which was
Right.
the Republicans, for political reasons, knowing that they didn't have the numbers to convict in the Senate, impeached Clinton. You can debate whether they had grounds, but they did it knowing that they wouldn't get a conviction or remove him from office, and the result was he was more popular than he had ever been in his
Right,
presidency.
but when they did it, he was already at 70% popularity.
Yeah.
Trump is not there.
Yeah.
And they were talking about lying about sex. When you look at the obstruction part of the Mueller report, there's an awful lot there.
Yeah.
So there is a sense that they're afraid, politically afraid, and not carrying out their constitutional duty. This is an
Interesting.
endless debate, which will go on for the next
Yeah.
year.
Interesting. Tony.
Good morning. I'm Tony Chappelle, class of '84. I've been a business reporter for the past 30 years. I'm interested in business models, and I wondered if you could talk about the business model that has kind of permeated since Trump has come in. We had I was at CNN in business news years ago, but it's a different network now. It's made its decision to become an advocate for one side, and I can understand that. But there's other publications and other media that have decided that same thing. And I'm wondering if we're ever going to be able to get the genie back in the tube once we made this decision that we had to take a stand on the side of history to keep, well, from whatever's going to be happening, happen. That's one question. Two, I'm just wondering, when it comes to the political campaigns that are going to take place, we get caught up, I think, in a lot of the shiny, bright objects. We get caught up in a lot of the tweets. But I'm wondering, when it comes to kitchen table type issues, are we going to actually see any candidates who really spend a lot of time talking about economics, talking about the impact that two wars at the same time have had on the U.S. economy? Because that's something I don't hear that much about. And the last thing, I just remember that there was a famous luncheon that President Obama had with Silicon Valley CEOs. And in that luncheon, he said, what can we do to get U.S. jobs back to this country? Steve Jobs, still alive at that time, said, Mr. President, those jobs aren't coming back. Has there any candidate that you've seen actually made some type of policies, has some type of platform, Cory Booker, I don't know, who's going to be more than just the typical candidate who shouts about the bright, shiny objects? I'll take my question at the seat.
I mean, I guess on the last thing, it is striking that in the Democratic Party, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, they don't argue with Trump about trade very much. I mean, they're sort of accepting of the kind of economic nationalism that he's introduced into our country. But what would you say about a couple of the other? I mean, Elizabeth, why don't you take the business model and
Right.
the extent to which people are being? Do you think it's valid to argue that the subscription model, for example, or the battle for ratings on cable has tempted news media into a kind of playing to a crowd that they know is passionate about one side but not the other?
Well, no. Let me speak for the New York Times. Obviously, we're at an all-time record high with paid subscribers. It's 4.3 million, and it's unheard of. But we were surprised, and a lot of that has been driven by Trump. There was definitely a Trump bump. We have people way above my pay grade at the Times keeping an eye on that and watching. And what we're told is that a lot of those people who signed on after Trump was elected have stayed with us. But there's a concern what happens after he's no longer on the scene, and there's, again, all sorts of things we're doing about that. So we're well aware of this Trump bump, and that the next presidency might not generate the same kind of fear among our readers, which drives them to the New York Times. So But I think, and I don't, I think that I wouldn't say, I'm sure CNN would not say that they're a pro democratic cable news network. But I do think that certainly Fox has benefited, in a big way. And I think what's really interesting is the relationship between Fox and this White House, which is really unprecedented, and the kind of advice that Trump is getting from Fox, from Sean Hannity, it's an amazing thing. So that's all I would say.
Why don't we go to Marianne?
Hi. I have a question, but I have two observations to make. One is getting back to the question of what went wrong. I think that journalists essentially believe in the system. They believe in the Constitution, they believe in truth, they believe in facts, and I think that's where we went wrong, because that's not what people are trying to bust the system. They don't believe it, they don't trust it. They say, they do say things, I don't trust, he's just as bad as this guy. They don't see the difference. Second of all, I happen to be blessed with many acquaintances and relatives who are Trump supporters. So I have a lot of conversations about this. And there's a simple answer that you get when you ask, what do you think of him? And it's this: they think he's doing a good job. It's that simple. It may not make sense to us, but that they think that. Okay, so totally different point, different question. Can you tell us, have your newsrooms developed policies related to stolen materials?
Tom, BuzzFeed was in the center
Yeah.
of some of this.
Yes.
And that wasn't stolen,
Well, no,
obviously.
that was not stolen.
Yeah.
It was not stolen.
The dossier we're talking about.
That was not stolen.
Wasn't exactly vindicated in the Mueller report, though, was it?
It was not vindicated in the Mueller report, but it's funny that you mentioned that. So Ben wrote, the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed, wrote what I thought was a really excellent just kind of piece on all of that. It's really interesting, I think, and it is getting to the heart of a little bit about what we're talking about right now with the Mueller report, where we say, look at all of this, whatever you want to call it, evidence or these facts or this timeline. And then we came to a point where Mueller, who the collective we have decided is the decider of whether or not this is a crime, what does that mean? What do both of these things mean? Here's all this evidence, and then he kind of made a decision to, however you want to categorize it, punt or not. In that piece, I thought Ben pretty clearly laid out the fact that the FBI person in the room who was interviewing Cohen wrote in his notes, which were his literal notes, that Trump directed him to lie. And then Mueller made a decision that he actually did not do it. And therein lies this kind of like balance of what we're all talking about right now. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it. So that's A. B, stolen information. We were one of the outlets that, I don't know if we were, that got some of the DC leaks information, which was stolen by Russia. And the way we handled that, I was actually very happy with the way we handled that, is we picked a specific lane. We did two things. A, I think we went and tried to find Hillary Clinton's speeches, and we did in those leaks. They were in the emails. The speeches that she, to large banks that she would not disclose. And we published a story on that. And then we also hit a vein about Colin Powell and his thoughts on Trump and how the Republican establishment was horrified by the Trump movement. What we intentionally did was, at the top third of every single one of those stories, make abundantly clear what this was. I think at the time the wording was, DC Leaks has been connected to, I'm not sure what arm of the Russian government it was, but has been connected to, this part of the Russian government. It is part of a campaign that's already been lightly reported on, but I think it was before the intelligence report, as trying to influence the election, and just like be extremely clear about what it is, where this is actually coming from, and then also be clear about why we give a crap about what we're writing about. And I think those are the two things that we want to balance. If it's all a case-by-case basis, I think, but I think those are the two most important things to balance if you are considering doing something with stolen material. Where is it coming from, and what is their motivation? And why are you specifically writing about this? Are you writing about it just because you have it, which I think is dangerous, or you're writing about it because it says something important, which, then it depends on what it says.
I mean, I guess now we're back in our ethics section here at the J School, but I mean, I guess you could ask, that's a very clear framework and a good one, I think, as on one side of the ledger. Of course, to be clear, under First Amendment jurisprudence, journalists are not vulnerable to prosecution for receiving materials that they know or have reason to think have been stolen. That's established, although that principle could erode. And the Assange case is worrisome because, right, he's been indicted. The Justice Department advertises that it's been restrained by indicting him only for a computer hacking crime, but in the affidavits that accompanied the indictment, they essentially seem to criminalize things that we would think of as normal reporting practices, such as encouraging a source to maybe bring more material to the table and that sort of thing. So it's a very dangerous area, I think, for press law. But I wonder, it's easy from the outside, not being in a newsroom and being faced with competition and relevance and so forth. I mean, is it a different category when you are aware that another government has hacked and stolen this information and is distributing it to you as the media for the precise purpose of influencing the outcome of an election? I mean, how can you be adequately transparent about that and then just let the readers decide? Or are there some forms of manipulation or theft that are just kind of stuff you walk away from?
You're looking. Oh, go
Please
ahead.
do.
No.
I definitely agree that you walk away from some of it, and I think that there are things that certainly I think we walked away from, and I'm sure other news outlets have as well. I do think one of the more important things in all of that is to not feel the competition. I think one of the errors that can be made is if you rush to compete with other outlets on whatever it is. I think that is the most important thing that you have to kind of suspend, and if you were just caught, and like this is coming from like a breaking news editor, my entire life is only thinking about how fast are we supposed to publish this thing, or how are we supposed to pull back? Like that's my constant calibration, almost 24 hours a day. And I think when you're dealing with that kind of stuff, the first thing you have to do is almost remove yourself from the competition until you know what you're doing is, if you think it's the right thing, and if you can explain it adequately, if you can provide the right context, and if you can show where it's actually coming from.
Brinley.
Class of '99, thank you. This has been fascinating. 2 questions. One thing I'm noticing in our newsroom is that some of especially the younger reporters, are really frustrated. They feel that, and I work actually at NBC, NBCnews.com, and they feel that this traditional approach to political reporting is really flawed. They feel that we are facing a real existential crisis, and that in trying too hard, bending over backwards to understand the Trump voter, why they rationalize supporting a man who separates, children from their parents at the border, why that actually is a completely flawed approach, and that by being the gatekeepers and being part of the establishment, we're dangerous. I would like to know if you all have faced similar things in the newsroom and how you're approaching that. And my second question is, we're also facing a very empowered evangelical population. It's quite large. And how are we covering that? How should we cover that without otherizing, which I think is a great way of looking at it? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Can I ask a question about the first question? The reporters are upset because people are seeking kind of like comment from Trump voters about family separation, for example?
No, it's not so much that. It's more that we as journalists aren't taking a stand. In doing the whole like horse trading, like, Biden just did this and this and the other, we're not kind of seeking to take a stand on, and not necessarily in an opinion way, seeking to take a stand on things that they consider to be objectively wrong and flawed and very dangerous.
The whole argument of false equivalence, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
We try to solve it with the way we frame things. The other day we wrote a headline that was like, "You may be surprised to learn that Trump just defended white supremacists again," with the press gaggle he did. And like, Is it like an opinion? Not quite there. Does it get some attitude in there? Sure. And is it wrong? If you ask me, no. You know, I think the way that we look at it is that there is a kind of clarity that we have to approach issues with, and I think family separations and a lot of the immigration coverage is one of those. We have to be kind of direct with the clarity, and I don't think that we need to, certainly the idea of presenting the other side, but we just have to, it's not necessarily picking a side, but like I think we're able to like call out when things are what they are, you know.
So Morgan, I want to hear you on this too, because you work at NBC, but you were, I thought, really strong in describing how vital it was to just talk to people where they are, not put them in categories, but just listen to them, talk to them. I mean, isn't that what we do? And so do you encounter a contradiction among your colleagues about just going out and talk to people where they are, trying to hear them, and some sense that you're abetting a crisis or you're complicit in an existential crisis? Is that a refrain you hear among your peers?
I have to be honest, Dean Coll. I'm in a tough spot when that question comes up, and I don't have the answers, and I don't think any of us do, if I'm really honest. And the reason I say that is because Trump, in labeling us as fake news, has put us in a really tough position. He's swung the pendulum so far right that by just reporting the facts and being centered, we appear left. So my question is always, in my mind, who do I push back to? Because I feel a moral responsibility and a moral guilt around the fact that during his campaign, as reporters across the spectrum, people weren't actually asking a lot of these tough questions. And it took them a while to say, no, Ms. Conway, you can't say that on our air at this time. No, Sarah Sanders, that just isn't true, right? It took us a long time to get there. And we're here because it took us so long. But my question is, because now I'm in this box of being fake news, do I push back on the voter on the street who I just asked her opinion and she definitely just cited a false fact? Do I push back and I'm labeled, I'm combative, I'm fake news, I'm just a liberal media, whatever? And so I asked a senior on our evening program about a particular issue I had when I was interviewing a Trump supporter. And I said, do you want me to push back to this particular woman? And they said, this woman, so I can't say this is across the platform, this is one senior producer who said this. She said for that particular story, on that particular program, on that particular day, she would rather me push back to the elected officials, but not to the voters on the street. Because it's fair to come for the elected officials and say, no, that's not right, Congresswoman, but it's not okay if you're just asking like Susan, and she's giving her opinion. Like, you don't want to kind of combat Susan. I don't know if that's right or wrong. I mean, today I had a show at 7. Somebody came on who's a Trump surrogate and said 98% of the accusations against the president when it came to sexual assault were false. I literally cut in, told the director, nope, we're going to put up a 3 box. And I looked at her and I said, I'm sorry, miss, where did you get that 98% number? I must know. Now, maybe I'm a liberal media, maybe I'm a whatever for saying that, but I can't let you rock with that, right? Like, not on my time, on my air. But it does put us in a really tough position. Yeah.
And just briefly on the evangelical questions, because my wife has been covering American evangelicals for the last year, and through her I have seen what an amazing story that is right now. And it's like everything else. It's very diverse, it's very complicated. There is a huge awakening going on of de-churched young evangelicals, some of them radically progressive, like living on the streets and serving others in some utopian vision. And there's so much diversity in the evangelical movement, especially among young people, and they're super suspicious of institutions. There's a Me Too evangelical movement that is grounded in traumatic experience over generations. So it's a great story, and it is crazy that we as a profession cannot find a way to tell it with subtlety and the kinds of strategies that we bring to everything else we try to cover as a social movement. It's because it's very dynamic right now. There's a lot of change going on.
Dean Coll, can I just add one more thing to what you were saying earlier? When we were talking about the question of responsibility, I also think it's really, really important that we are holding the higher ups across organizations accountable for that responsibility, because the truth is we don't actually make those choices on the ground. And I think for every journalist in this room, especially for the young journalists, as you go out, it's often important to remind people about what the steps are between when you write something and when it goes to publication or air. So do you know how dumb I looked? How many people tweeted at me when I was interviewing a cold-blooded bigot and I was calling him like some euphemistic term for some ultra-conservative, and like, how dumb do I look as a woman of color not being able to say that? But what they never realized was, like, I had to go through 3 layers of legal and standards, and I was told I wasn't allowed to call him a bigot, right? So it's important to remember that we have to have a conversation at a pay level that's much higher than mine about how we're going to handle that. And it took the AP until last month to tell us we could call them racist. So then my legal and standards department got their cue from the AP, which now I can say it's a racist comment. But maybe we shouldn't have been waiting for the AP, and maybe we shouldn't have been waiting, but like, that's actually not my call. So I think it's important to remind people at this time of heightened mistrust what the processes actually are.
Yeah, that's well said. Okay, I'm afraid we've just got time for one more question. So, we can ask 2 really rapid questions if they're not accompanied by long statements.
They're not. Hi, I'm Marika. I'm class of 2014. Thank you for this panel. Obviously, American networks are very involved in covering their own election, but so are international networks. I work in Canada. A lot of what happens here directly impacts us as well. Is there any specific storyline over the last 4 years going into 2020, that storyline, tool in your newsroom, that you think other international networks need to really pay attention to, or that they missed in their coverage watching the American election coverage sort of happen over the last few years?
Okay, let's table that, and we'll take the last question, and then we'll answer them both.
Short question. Janet Wu, formerly with NBC in Boston, now with Bloomberg. Number 1, I wish we had time to share with us some of the policy changes you had to make in your newsroom to deal with Trump, just like Reuters specifically said this is what you do with verbal physical assault. The second question, which is probably the fitting question to end, do you believe we can return to the level of political civility we had before 2016? Ever?
Well, I would take issue with this political civility. It's gotten a little worse, but the history. I don't want to go back too far, but the history of the country, there was great political incivility, 100 years ago. So, but to take more recent times, I always say this. People disagree with me. I think this presidency is an aberration, and I think that when Trump is no longer on the scene, there'll be a going back. There'll be it'll be, I mean, we went from Obama to Trump, don't forget. We can go from Trump to someone else who will be very different. And I don't think that he will have, I don't think this will continue. I don't think the next president is going to be tweeting out insults and going after his own, attorney general, going after our allies. I just don't see that happening. People disagree with me, but that's what I think.
I think in terms of civility, I mean, the X factor of 2016 is the polarization of social media, and until that, and there is no, I don't have any kind of answer here, but until that comes under some kind of control to some degree, control either from the platforms themselves, fighting outright racism, polarization, extreme polarization, fake news, disinformation, and also, I guess everyone's just getting a little tired of it. I don't know how that's going to change otherwise. There was a couple comments in here about the kitchen table and what people are talking about. What we need to remember and realize is the kitchen table is on social media. That is where it is. It is real life, whether we like it or not. There's real conversations happening there, and there's also fake conversations that people can't tell the difference.
I think, like it or love it, Trump is one of a kind. He is something that we have just not seen before. On the other side, Obama was also one of a kind. And I think that when we're watching what happened with Trump, look at what happened in response to Trump. We've seen the number of women running for office, people who had never even voted before, decided they were going to run in their local elections. We saw people who were transgender winning office in Virginia. We saw Ayanna Pressley in Boston. I guarantee you, and I promise you, civility will come back.
I mean, thank you all very, very much for sitting still during this long conversation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. Welcome back to the school.
I'm not even a journalist anymore. I just wanted to say, it was such a pleasure when I saw that because you're
Hi. Hi. Good. How are you?